Hey there, it's Chris Acton with Acting Creative, and this is A Handwoven Experience. And in this episode, I'm going to talk about stash busting for weavers. This is part 2 in a 2-part series tackling this really interesting topic of how to diminish the things in your inventory. Now, I first heard of the term stash busting from my other fiber friends, the knitters and crocheters in my life. And as I thought about how they would use the term stash busting, I thought, okay, but stash busting for a weaver is a little bit different, right? Because weavers collect a few more things. We don't just have little bits of yarn left over, right? We might also have little bits of yarn. These are thrums, the little pieces that are left over from your projects, right? From that kind of dead zone in the middle of the loom, or from the beginning or the end of the project when you're tying your warp on to the loom. So maybe you don't collect thrums, but I always do. And about, I don't know, a few months back, I did a whole episode all about some ideas for thrums and what to do with them. So we collect yarn, thrums, and also there's almost always little bits of fabric left over, right? Because weaving is such a kind of a big process. We don't want to leave anything to chance. So I don't know about you, but I always add on plenty of extra inches to my project. So when I'm done making the 2 table runners I was going to make, there's still space left for me to weave something fun or play or whatever that is. And what that means for me is that I have little bits of fabric left over. So in our episode today, I'm going to give you some ideas for how to think about your leftover bits of fabric and reduce your overall stash of your stacks of fabric left over from your projects. So let's talk about some ideas for us, right? Now, typically, your little bits of fabric can come in all shapes and sizes. You may have a little bit. This one was a project that we specifically cut off, right? So I just have a little bit left here. You may have a bigger chunk, right? Those bits of fabric can come in all shapes and sizes and have all kinds of fibers involved. So that's something you want to start thinking about right out of the gates. Is it what kind of fiber is involved? And does that influence how you use that little fabric stash, right? So here's some ideas for ways that you might be able to use up the little bits you have left. What if you made little bags? Now, this is going to require that you sew, and if you're like me and you don't sew, maybe connect with someone who does, or just come up with some ideas that don't require some sewing. But little bags are always a sweet way to use little bits of fabric. I like this kind of wallet size because it's just so narrow, so you don't need a very wide piece, right? Something like this. You could also this is like a little eyeglass case, which if you look is hardly any fabric at all, right? Just a little swatch would do you to do a little something like this. So any kind of bag, I think, is always such a nice little way to use up those odds and ends. Also, if you have a sewing machine that's very fancy, or you know someone who does, which is what I do, you can do things like, this is a little ornament. Look at this little swatch. This is all it required to do this kind of project. So you know how fancy sewing machines are now, is that if you have one that can do some of this kind of stuff, it's a brilliant way to use up all those little bits of fabric that you have left over from your stash. And one of my last ideas is don't forget that you can then use your hand woven in other things. This is a beautiful little piece that my seamstress Joyce did for me once upon a time. And it's much fancier than anything that I would ever think of. Look at this with all the dividers. Like, she did this beautiful job. But I love the fact that she took all these just little bits and she just incorporated them with something else. So it gives a little interest to the overall piece. Isn't that pretty? It's much fancier than anything I could ever dream of. But I want to make sure that you have plenty of ideas for what to do with your little bits of fabric. You could also do things like coasters or mug rugs, as you sometimes hear them called. So something like that is a great little project because it doesn't have to be very, very big, right? You also don't necessarily have to line it or do something on the back of it. However, here's what I would caution. Remember at the top of the conversation I talked about you just have to kind of consider what your leftover fabric is made of. So if you're thinking something like a coaster, ponder how your fabric is going to be if it gets wet, because that's the whole point of a coaster, is to absorb the moisture, right? So be sure to think through matching up your fabric with the item that you're going to make. There's no right or wrong. Just think through if it's going to support, if you want to do coasters, is your fabric going to be okay getting wet? Think through some of those kind of things. If you have something that's like a lighter weight like this, you absolutely could maybe cut out some washcloths or something else where it's going to absorb nicely, it's going to be fine enough, it's going to drape, whatever that is. So just ponder as you're thinking of ways to reduce your stash of leftover fabric. Think through the item and then the fabric, and as you pair them up, are they going to work well together? But there's no end to the list of ideas. And I know you have some other great ideas. So in the comments, share with me some other ideas for how to use your leftover fabric, because between the two of us, we can put together a nice comprehensive list so that next time we look on our shelves and we're like, oh, it's a lot of fabric. It's a lot of leftover fabric sitting there. We have a nice beefy list of things that we can do with it, so that we're always finding unique and creative ways to use up those really sweet little nuggets of handwoven fabric that you have that weren't part of the original plan, right? It's all about reducing that stash. So I hope I gave you some things to ponder and maybe a little inspiration for how to use up your leftover bits of very special handwoven fabric. All right, my friend. Let me know how you use all your great leftover bits. Have a wonderful week. Happy weaving.